Commander sat in the dimly lit cantina on Station Omega-7, his four arms wrapped around a glass of fermented kelp wine. The blue liquid swirled as his hands trembled slightly, a condition that had plagued him since his return from the human conflict zone 3 cycles ago. Around him, other veterans of various species shared their own war stories, but none spoke of the humans. None except the young recruit at the next table kept stealing glances at the decorated commander. Everyone knew his reputation. Had led the 47th Galactic Infantry through 12 major campaigns across the Outer Rim. His tactical brilliance had earned him medals from 6 different worlds. But it was his service alongside the humans that had made him a legend, though not in the way most would expect. "Tell us about Earth's warriors," the recruit finally worked up the courage to ask, his translucent skin flushing with nervous excitement. The recruitment videos make them sound unstoppable. His large, compound eyes fixed on the young soldier. His mandibles clicked once, a sign of deep contemplation among his people. The cantina grew quieter, other conversations dying as beings leaned in to listen. Stories about human military prowess were rare, and those who had fought alongside them rarely spoke of the experience. "You want to know about humans?" His voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Sit down, young one. What I'm about to tell you will change how you see war forever." He eagerly pulled his chair closer, joined by several other soldiers who had been eavesdropping. Took a long drink of his wine, his primary eyes focusing on something far beyond the cantina walls. It was during the siege of 442B. The hegemony had established a fortress on that world, using it as a staging ground for their push into the inner sectors. High Command decided it needed to be taken, and they assembled a joint task force. 5 different species, each bringing their specialty to the operation. He paused, setting down his glass with deliberate care. The provided heavy assault troops, naturally, the brought their engineering corps, the contributed their aerial superiority squadrons, the offered their reconnaissance specialists. Another pause, longer this time, and then there were the humans. A server droid rolled by, its mechanical whirring the only sound in the suddenly silent cantina. Secondary eyes tracked its movement while his primary pair remained distant. We had all heard stories, of course. Rumors about this young species that had emerged from the galactic rim barely 2 centuries ago. They had a reputation for being stubborn, for never surrendering. Some called them brave, others called them stupid. I thought the truth was probably somewhere in between. The recruit shifted impatiently. But surely their technology, their tactics, something made them valuable allies. His mandibles clicked again, this time in what his species used as bitter laughter. Their technology was adequate, not exceptional but serviceable. Their tactics were straightforward, sometimes crude. What made them valuable, young one, was something none of us expected. The commander's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, forcing everyone to lean in closer. It was their relationship with death itself. He reached into his uniform pocket and a small, metallic object. It was a human military decoration, a simple bronze star that caught the cantina's artificial light. The young soldiers stared at it with curiosity. This belonged to Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, 3rd Human Expeditionary Force. She gave it to me 3 days before the assault began, said she had a feeling she wouldn't be needing it anymore. His voice carried a note of something that might have been reverence. I thought it was typical human superstition. We don't believe in premonitions or luck. We believe in firepower and superior positioning. The bronze star disappeared back into his pocket. The initial assault went according to plan. Our heavy troops punched through their outer defenses. Engineers cleared the mine fields. Fighters eliminated their air support. Everything was proceeding as the tactical computers had predicted. His expression darkened. Then we reached the inner fortress. Stood abruptly, his impressive height making the smaller species around him crane their necks upward. He moved to the cantina's large viewport, staring out at the stars beyond. The hegemony had turned the place into a death trap. Overlapping fields of fire, automated defense turrets, energy barriers channeling any assault force into kill zones. Our advance stalled completely. We lost 2 full companies trying to breach their main gate. They couldn't get close enough to provide air support. Our heavy weapons couldn't penetrate their shielding. The commander's reflection in the viewport showed eyes that had seen horrors beyond imagination. High Command was ready to call off the assault. The cost in lives would have been astronomical. That's when the humans volunteered for what they called a diversionary action. He returned to his seat but remained standing behind it, gripping the chair back with all four hands. Colonel Harrison, their commanding officer, requested a private meeting with the Joint Command staff. He was a small man by human standards, barely came up to my chest. Quiet, methodical, not at all what you'd expect from a species known for aggression. The cantina had filled while spoke, word spreading that the famous commander was finally telling his human war stories. Beings of a dozen different species listened in rapt attention. Harrison laid out his plan with the kind of casual precision that should have terrified us. His people would create multiple diversion points around the fortress perimeter. Small teams would infiltrate the outer defenses and cause as much chaos as possible, drawing hegemony forces away from the main gate. It would give our assault forces the opening they needed. His voice took on a haunted quality. What he didn't say, what none of us understood at the time, was that his diversionary action was essentially a suicide mission. The teams he was sending out had no extraction plan, no fallback position, no support beyond what they carried on their backs. The young recruit looked confused, but surely they had some chance of survival, some contingency. The commander fixed him with a stare that made the young soldier shrink back in his chair. You still don't understand, do you? The humans weren't planning to survive. They were planning to die as effectively as possible. The weight of those words settled over the cantina like a heavy blanket. Several of the listening beings shifted uncomfortably, not certain they wanted to hear more. I confronted Harrison about it before the operation began, asked him directly about casualty projections for his teams. You know what he told me? His voice carried a mixture of admiration and horror. He said, and I quote, "Commander, we've already written our letters home. Now we're just deciding how many of the enemy we can take with us." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant hum of the station's life support systems. Finally sat down, suddenly looking older than his considerable years. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about what Harrison had said, about the casual way he had accepted not just his own death, but the deaths of everyone under his command. In culture, death in battle is honorable, but it should serve a purpose. It should achieve something meaningful. He gestured toward the stars beyond the viewport. Every species in the galaxy has its warriors, its heroes willing to die for their people. But humans had turned dying into an art form. They had calculated exactly how much destruction they could cause with their lives, and they were prepared to spend those lives like currency. The commander's expression grew distant again, lost in memories of a battle that had occurred light years away and years in the past. The assault began at dawn, their dawn. 442B rotated slowly, so their day-night cycle was nearly 30 standard hours. The humans had been studying the fortress for days, timing everything perfectly. His voice took on the cadence of a military report, but the emotion beneath it remained raw. At 600 local time, 7 human teams moved out. Each team consisted of 4 soldiers carrying enough explosives to level a city block. Their mission parameters were simple: cause maximum damage to hegemony infrastructure and hold their positions until eliminated. Reached for his wine glass, then seemed to think better of it, leaving his hands resting on the table. I watched through tactical scopes as they approached the fortress walls. They moved like ghosts, using every shadow, every piece of cover. But once they reached their target points, stealth was abandoned entirely. The cantina patrons hung on every word, many of them military personnel who understood the implications of what they were hearing. The idea of soldiers abandoning all hope of survival was alien to most galactic cultures. Team Alpha struck first, detonating their charges against the fortress's main power distribution center. The explosion was visible from orbit. Before the hegemony forces could even respond, Teams Beta and Gamma hit their water purification plant and ammunition depot simultaneously. His mandibles clicked in what might have been approval or horror. But here's what made it truly terrifying to watch. After the explosions, when any reasonable soldier would try to escape or find cover, the humans did the opposite. They held their ground and fought. The young recruit leaned forward eagerly. How long did they hold out? His compound eyes fixed on him again. Team Alpha held their position for 6 hours and 17 minutes. During that time, they eliminated 43 hegemony soldiers and destroyed 2 armored vehicles using nothing but small arms and improvised explosives. They had no air support, no artillery backup, no hope of reinforcement. He paused, letting the magnitude of that statement sink in. Team Beta lasted 8 hours. Team Gamma managed almost 10 before they were overrun, and in every case, the final transmission was the same. Enemy casualty reports followed by mission accomplished. The commander stood again, this time moving to the bar where he ordered another glass of wine. The bartender, a six-armed with intricate tattoos covering his exoskeleton, served him with the kind of respectful silence usually reserved for grieving relatives. By the time our main assault began, the fortress was in chaos. Half their defensive systems were offline, their command structure was in disarray, and their mobile reserve units were scattered across the outer perimeter trying to contain human teams that were no longer there to contain. Returned to his table, the new glass untouched in his hands. We took the fortress in 6 hours. What should have been a months-long siege with catastrophic casualties turned into a standard assault operation. The humans had given us victory, paid for with their lives in the most deliberate, calculated way imaginable. The cantina had grown crowded, beings pressed close to hear every word. Among them were veterans from other campaigns, nodding grimly as they recognized elements of their own experiences with human allies. After the battle, I found Colonel Harrison's body in what used to be the fortress's command bunker. He had fought his way inside and died trying to destroy their communication equipment. In his hand was a data pad containing messages from his soldiers' families. Wives, children, parents, all sending love and support for a mission none of them knew was a suicide run. The commander's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of emotion he had shown since beginning his story. That's when I understood what we were really dealing with. These weren't just soldiers willing to die for their cause. These were beings who had looked at death as carefully as any other tactical consideration and decided it was an acceptable price for victory. He took a sip of his wine, his hands steady now despite the weight of his memories. But that was just the beginning. The siege of 442B was my introduction to human warfare, not the culmination of it. Over the next 2 years, I would serve alongside human forces in 17 different campaigns. Each one taught me something new about the depths of their tactical brutality. The young recruit looked both fascinated and disturbed. You make them sound like monsters. Considered this for a long moment, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's artificial lighting. Monsters? No, monsters kill for pleasure, for power, for the simple joy of destruction. Humans killed with precision, with purpose, with a kind of mathematical certainty that was far more terrifying than any monster. He gestured toward the crowd that had gathered around his table. Look around you. Every species here has warriors, soldiers who have seen combat, but none of our cultures have produced anything quite like human military doctrine. We fight to win, they fight to end conflicts permanently. The commander's expression grew contemplative. It took me months to understand the difference. When we win a battle, we celebrate victory. When humans win a battle, they calculate how many future battles they've prevented through the thoroughness of their current victory. Several of the listening veterans nodded grimly, clearly recognizing the pattern was describing. The reputation of human military forces had spread throughout the galaxy, but few beings truly understood what made them so effective. The next major engagement came 4 months later, during the campaign of the Seven Worlds. The hegemony had established a supply line running through a cluster of inhabited systems, using civilian populations as human shields to prevent orbital bombardment. His voice took on the distant quality of someone recounting events almost too difficult to believe. Standard galactic military doctrine calls for siege warfare in such situations. Cut off supply lines, establish blockades, wait for the enemy to abandon their positions. It's clean, it's civilized, and it minimizes civilian casualties. He paused, rotating his glass slowly between his fingers. The humans took one look at the tactical situation and proposed something that made every other species' military advisors question their sanity. They wanted to insert small teams directly into the occupied cities and conduct urban warfare operations while simultaneously protecting the civilian population. The young recruit's eyes widened. That's impossible. You can't fight in a city full of civilians without causing massive collateral damage. His mandibles clicked in that bitter approximation of laughter. That's exactly what we told them. Every military textbook in the galaxy says urban combat with civilian populations present is a tactical nightmare. Too many variables, too much potential for catastrophic mistakes. He leaned back in his chair, his forearms spreading wide in a gesture of amazement that was still evident years after the fact. Colonel Martinez, Harrison's replacement, listened to all our objections with the kind of patience you'd show a child explaining why they can't touch a hot stove. Then she pulled out a data pad and showed us something called the Mogadishu Protocol. The commander paused in his narrative, noting how the crowd around him had grown even larger. Word was spreading through the station that the legendary officer was finally sharing his experiences with human military forces. Beings from across the galactic community pressed closer, many recording his words for later analysis. The Mogadishu Protocol, continued, was a tactical framework developed by human military theorists centuries before they achieved faster-than-light travel. It was designed specifically for urban combat scenarios where enemy forces were embedded within civilian populations. He gestured toward the viewport where stars glittered in the distance, each one potentially harboring worlds that had witnessed human military operations. What made it remarkable wasn't the tactics themselves, but the underlying philosophy. Every other species approaches urban warfare as a problem to be avoided. Humans approached it as a puzzle to be solved. The young recruit shifted in his seat, clearly struggling to understand concepts that challenged everything he had learned in military academy. But surely the risk to civilians made such operations impractical. His expression grew somber. That's where you misunderstand human military thinking. They didn't see civilian casualties as an unavoidable consequence of urban combat. They saw them as a failure of tactical precision. To them, protecting civilians wasn't just morally imperative, it was a measure of professional competence. The commander reached into another pocket and a small recording device, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. Colonel Martinez gave me this after the Seven Worlds campaign. It contains audio recordings from human tactical operations during those battles. With her permission, I'd like you to hear what human urban warfare actually sounds like. He activated the device, and suddenly the cantina was filled with voices speaking in calm, measured tones despite the obvious sounds of combat in the background. Weapons, fire, explosions, and shouting could be heard, but the human voices remained steady and professional. Overwatch, this is Team 7. We have visual on hegemony position, grid reference Delta 47. Civilian family visible in adjacent building, recommend precision strike only. Copy Team 7. Civilian safety protocols in effect. You are cleared for surgical strike only. Confirm minimal collateral damage approach. Confirmed Overwatch. Switching to directed energy weapons minimum power setting. Estimated civilian risk, 0%. Deactivated the recording, letting the sounds of the cantina return. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the distant hum of station machinery. That conversation took place during one of the heaviest firefights of the campaign. Human forces were outnumbered 3-1, taking fire from multiple directions, with enemy forces literally using civilian buildings as cover. And yet their primary concern was ensuring 0 civilian casualties. The commander's voice carried a note of something approaching awe. I was monitoring their communications throughout the operation. In 8 hours of continuous urban combat, across 17 different engagement zones, not a single human unit fired a shot without first confirming civilian safety. Not one. A veteran near the back of the crowd called out, "What was their casualty rate? That kind of restraint must have cost them." Turned toward the voice, his compound eyes reflecting the cantina's lighting. 43%. Nearly half of the human forces engaged in those operations were either killed or wounded. But they achieved something no other military force in galactic history had managed. They cleared 7 occupied cities without killing a single civilian. The implications of that statement rippled through the crowd like a physical force. Urban warfare was universally considered the most dangerous and unpredictable form of combat, with civilian casualties viewed as an unfortunate but inevitable consequence. "How is such precision possible?" asked an intelligence officer, her voice betraying professional curiosity mixed with disbelief. The commander returned to his seat, his movements deliberate and measured. "That's what I asked Colonel Martinez after the campaign ended. Her answer changed my understanding of human military capability permanently." He took a sip of his wine, organizing his thoughts before continuing. "She told me that human soldiers train differently than any other species' military forces. While we train our troops to achieve objectives and eliminate threats, humans train their soldiers to make moral calculations under fire. The young recruit looked confused. Moral calculations in the middle of combat. Nodded slowly. Every human soldier undergoes what they call ethical combat training. They practice scenarios where they must choose between tactical advantage and civilian safety, between personal survival and protecting non-combatants. They drill these decisions until they become automatic responses. The commander's expression grew distant as he accessed memories that clearly still troubled him. I watched a human sergeant named William sacrifice a perfect tactical position because his sniper nest was in a building where civilians were sheltering. He gave up a commanding view of the battlefield and moved to a less advantageous location rather than risk a stray bullet hitting innocent people. He paused, letting the weight of that decision settle over his audience. Williams died holding that inferior position. He could have survived if he'd taken the tactically superior location, but he chose civilian safety over his own life without hesitation. The cantina had grown so quiet that the soft whir of environmental systems seemed loud in comparison. Beings from across the galaxy struggled to process the implications of what they were hearing. But that wasn't the most disturbing part, continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The most disturbing part was watching his squad mates react to his death. They didn't mourn him as a casualty of impossible circumstances. They honored him as someone who had made the right choice under pressure. The commander stood and began packing behind his chair, his four arms gesturing as he spoke. To humans, Williams hadn't died because of poor tactics or bad luck. He had died because he upheld their military code perfectly. His death was seen as validation of their training, not a failure of it. A veteran officer near the front of the crowd spoke up, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded troops in major campaigns. Such thinking would destroy unit cohesion. Soldiers can't function if they believe sacrifice is expected rather than exceptional. His mandibles clicked in disagreement. That's what I thought too, but I was wrong. Human military units don't just maintain cohesion despite these expectations, they achieve superior combat effectiveness because of them. He returned to his seat, leaning forward intensely. Consider the psychological impact on enemy forces. When you're fighting an opponent who you know will choose death over compromise, who will sacrifice tactical advantages to protect civilians, who treats their own survival as secondary to mission completion. How do you plan against such an enemy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Military officers from multiple species exchanged glances, clearly working through tactical scenarios in their minds. The hegemony learned this lesson during the offensive, continued. Their intelligence reports from that campaign have since become required reading at the Galactic Military Academy. They provide fascinating insight into how a traditional military force attempts to counter human tactical doctrine. The commander activated his recording device again, but this time the voices were different, speaking in the harsh consonants of the hegemony's primary language, with subtitles appearing on the device's small screen. Command, this is Sector 7. Human forces have established defensive positions around the civilian evacuation zone. Recommend immediate orbital bombardment to eliminate threat. Negative, Sector 7. Intelligence indicates humans will not abandon civilian protection duty regardless of force applied against them. Bombardment would result in massive civilian casualties without tactical gain. Understood, Command, but our ground forces cannot advance while humans maintain position. Request guidance on alternative approach. Stand by, Sector 7. We are withdrawing from this sector entirely. Human defensive positions are considered impenetrable as long as civilians require protection. Deactivated the device, letting the full implications of what they had heard settle over the crowd. The hegemony from an entire star system rather than fight human forces protecting civilian evacuation operations. Not because they couldn't win, but because the cost of victory would have been strategically meaningless. The young recruit looked stunned. They abandoned an entire world because humans were protecting civilians. The commander nodded grimly. It gets worse. The hegemony's tactical analysis concluded that engaging human forces in any scenario involving civilian populations was strategically counterproductive. Human willingness to accept casualties while maintaining civilian protection protocols made such engagements Pyrrhic victories at best. He gestured toward the stars beyond the viewport. Within 6 months of the withdrawal, hegemony forces began avoiding any system where human military units were deployed in civilian protection roles. They essentially ceded entire sectors rather than face the tactical nightmare of fighting an enemy that treated civilian casualties as personal failure. An officer near the bar called out, "But surely human forces had weaknesses, some tactical approach that could be exploited." His expression grew even more troubled. "That's what we all assumed. No military force is perfect, no tactical doctrine is without flaws. So command assigned me to conduct a comprehensive analysis of human military capabilities, looking specifically for exploitable weaknesses." The commander's voice took on the tone of someone delivering unwelcome news. "I spent 8 months embedded with various human military units, observing their training, studying their tactical manuals, interviewing their officers. What I found challenged every assumption I had about military science." He stood and moved to the viewport again, staring out at the vast expanse of space. "Human military doctrine doesn't have traditional weaknesses because it's built around the assumption that everything will go wrong simultaneously. They don't plan for best-case scenarios or even likely outcomes. They plan for absolute disaster and then develop tactics to succeed anyway." The commander turned back to face his audience, his expression conveying a mixture of admiration and horror that was deeply unsettling to witness. "I watched them conduct training exercises where they simulated scenarios no other species would even consider. What if your commanding officer is killed in the first minute of combat? What if your primary weapons malfunction? What if you're cut off from all support with wounded civilians depending on you for protection?" He returned to his seat but remained standing behind it. Other military forces train their soldiers to execute plans successfully. Human forces train their soldiers to succeed when all plans have failed catastrophically. They call it embrace the chaos doctrine. The young recruit shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "That sounds like a recipe for military disaster, not success." His mandibles clicked in bitter agreement. "That's exactly what I thought when I first observed their training exercises. Watching human soldiers practice combat scenarios where everything goes wrong seemed like the worst possible preparation for actual warfare." He paused, organizing his thoughts carefully. "Then I witnessed the Battle of 186F, and I understood what they had been preparing for." The commander's voice grew heavy with the weight of memory. 186F was supposed to be a simple operation. Intelligence indicated minimal hegemony presence, outdated defensive systems, and a quick victory that would give us control of a strategically important hyperspace junction. Several of the listening veterans nodded grimly, recognizing the setup for a military disaster. Operations described as simple rarely remained that way once combat began. The assault force consisted of joint units from 4 species, with human forces providing specialized urban combat support. The plan called for a coordinated orbital insertion followed by rapid seizure of key infrastructure points. Standard doctrine, properly executed. His expression darkened as he continued. Intelligence was wrong about everything. Hegemony forces were present in numbers 3 times larger than estimated. Their defensive systems had been upgraded with technology we'd never seen before. And the simple operation turned into the worst military disaster in the Joint Command's history. The commander began packing again, his forearms moving restlessly as he recalled events that clearly still disturbed him. Within 30 minutes of the initial assault, everything had gone catastrophically wrong. Our orbital support was neutralized by hegemony anti-ship weapons. Ground forces were scattered across the planet by defensive fire. Communications were jammed, supply lines were cut, and command structure collapsed entirely. He stopped packing and fixed his gaze on the young recruit. In that situation, military doctrine calls for organized withdrawal. When an operation fails so completely, so quickly, the only rational response is to minimize casualties and regroup for future operations. The commander's voice dropped to barely audible levels. The humans didn't withdraw. They didn't even attempt to reestablish contact with off-world command. Instead, they did something that violated every principle of military science I had ever learned. He activated his recording device one final time, and the cantina filled with the sounds of chaos. Explosions, Weapons, fire, and shouting voices created a cacophony of combat, but cutting through it all were calm human voices coordinating impossible operations. "This is Lieutenant Parker, 2nd Platoon. Command structure is down, communications are jammed, and we're surrounded by superior forces. Implementing Protocol 7. "Copy that, Parker. This is Sergeant, 5th Squad. We're in the same situation. Civilian evacuation center is 2 clicks from your position. Can you provide cover?" "Affirmative. We'll hold this intersection indefinitely. Get those civilians to safety." "Understood. See you on the other side, Parker." Deactivated the device, and the sudden silence seemed almost physical in its weight. "Protocol 7, he said quietly, was something I had never heard of before that day. It wasn't in any human military manual I had access to, wasn't mentioned in their tactical training documents. The commander's expression conveyed a mixture of awe and horror that was deeply disturbing to witness. After the battle, I asked Colonel Martinez about Protocol 7. She looked at me for a long moment, then said something I will never forget. "Protocol 7 isn't something we teach, Commander. It's something humans do when there's no choice left but to be human." The implications of that statement settled over the crowd like a heavy blanket, and could see understanding dawn in the eyes of military veterans from across the galaxy. They were beginning to grasp what made human military forces truly alien. The cantina had reached capacity, with beings standing in doorways and crowding around the bar to hear its conclusion. Word had spread throughout Station Omega 7 that the legendary commander was sharing the complete story of his service with human forces, something he had refused to do for 3 years since his return. "Protocol 7, the commander continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had witnessed the impossible, was what happened when human military forces abandoned all conventional tactical thinking and operated purely on what they called moral imperatives." He moved away from his table, addressing the crowd directly for the first time since beginning his story. "During the Battle of 186F, I watched 847 human soldiers, cut off from all support and facing certain annihilation, choose to protect 12,000 civilian refugees rather than attempt their own escape." The numbers hit the crowd like physical blows. Military officers from across the galaxy quickly calculated the tactical mathematics involved. Less than 900 soldiers protecting more than 12,000 non-combatants against overwhelming enemy forces. "The logical choice was clear," continued. "Abandon the civilians and attempt to reach extraction zones. Human forces had transportation enough to evacuate perhaps 200 of the refugees along with their own personnel. From a purely tactical standpoint, saving 1,047 lives instead of losing all 13,000 was the rational decision." The commander's mandibles clicked in a pattern his species used to express profound confusion mixed with admiration. Instead, they made a choice that violated every principle of military logic I had ever studied. They sent the evacuation transports away empty and stayed to defend all 12,000 civilians with their lives. A veteran pilot near the viewport spoke up, his voice carrying the skepticism of someone who had flown countless military operations. "That's not tactical thinking, that's suicide. How could their officers justify such a decision?" Turned toward the speaker, his compound eyes reflecting something that might have been respect or horror. "That's what I asked Colonel Martinez during the battle. I was monitoring their command frequencies, watching them organize what was clearly a hopeless last stand, and I couldn't understand the strategic reasoning." The commander activated a different recording device, this one containing what was clearly a real-time communication between himself and the human colonel during the height of combat. "Colonel Martinez, this is Commander. Your tactical situation is untenable. Recommend immediate evacuation of essential personnel." "Negative, Commander. We have 12,000 souls depending on us for protection. Evacuation is not an option." "Colonel, with respect, your current position cannot be held against the forces arrayed against you. Tactical withdrawal would allow you to preserve your command for future operations." "Commander, I think you misunderstand our mission parameters. We're not here to preserve our command. We're here to preserve those civilians. If that requires our lives, then that's the cost of doing business." "But Colonel, the strategic value of—" "Commander, there is no strategic value greater than the lives of innocent people. We knew this was a possibility when we took the oath. We're prepared for the consequences." Deactivated the recording, and the silence that followed was profound. The casual acceptance of death in those human voices was unlike anything most of the listeners had ever heard. That conversation took place 4 hours into what became a 36-hour siege, the commander continued. Human forces held defensive positions around the civilian evacuation center, while hegemony troops attempted to break their lines. The humans had enough ammunition for perhaps 6 hours of sustained combat. They had medical supplies for treating maybe 50 wounded. They had food and water for their own forces to last 12 hours. He paused, letting the mathematics of the situation become clear to his audience. They held for 36 hours. They protected 12,000 civilians for 36 hours with resources calculated to last perhaps 12 hours under optimal conditions. The young recruit looked stunned. How is such endurance possible? What were they using for supplies? His expression grew haunted. They weren't using supplies, young one. They were using themselves. When ammunition ran low, they charged hegemony positions with improvised weapons. When medical supplies were exhausted, wounded soldiers continued fighting until they couldn't stand. When food and water ran out, they shared their personal rations with the civilians they were protecting. The commander moved back to his table, but remained standing, his 4 arms spread wide in a gesture of amazement that was still evident years after the fact. I monitored their communications throughout the siege. As conditions deteriorated, as their situation became increasingly hopeless, their tactical efficiency actually improved. They fought better as they approached death, not worse. An intelligence officer in the crowd called out. What was their casualty rate by the end? The cantina fell silent as everyone waited for the answer to what was clearly a crucial question. Its expression conveyed emotions too complex for easy interpretation. 100%, he said quietly. Every single human soldier involved in the defense of 186F was either killed or wounded. Not one escaped unharmed. The weight of that statement settled over the crowd like a physical force. Total casualty rates were virtually unknown in modern galactic warfare, where tactical withdrawal and strategic repositioning were considered basic survival skills. But they succeeded, continued, his voice carrying a note of profound respect. All 12,000 civilians were evacuated safely when relief forces finally broke through hegemony lines. Not a single refugee was harmed during the 36-hour siege. The commander reached into his uniform and the bronze star he had shown earlier, holding it up so the crowd could see it clearly. This belonged to Sergeant Santos, whom I mentioned at the beginning. She died in the final hour of the siege, holding a defensive position that protected the civilian loading area from hegemony assault troops. He turned the medal slowly, letting light reflect off its worn surface. According to the tactical reports, she eliminated 17 enemy soldiers with a damaged rifle and 3 grenades before being overwhelmed. Her final transmission was a casualty report followed by civilian secure. Mission accomplished. The silence in the cantina was broken only by the distant sounds of station life continuing around them. Beings from across the galaxy struggled to process what they had heard. After the battle, continued, I participated in the casualty recovery operations. I helped identify human remains and collect personal effects for return to their families. It was during that process that I finally understood what made human military forces so alien to the rest of us. The commander's voice took on the reverential tone usually reserved for religious ceremonies. Every single human soldier carried letters from home, not just 1 or 2, but dozens. Letters from spouses, children, parents, friends, even strangers who had heard about their deployment, and every letter said essentially the same thing. He paused, clearly struggling with emotions that were difficult to express in words. They didn't say, come home safely, or avoid unnecessary risks. They said, make it count, and protect those who can't protect themselves, and do what's right regardless of the cost. The implications of that revelation rippled through the crowd. Most galactic cultures encouraged their military personnel to prioritize survival and return home safely. The idea of families actively encouraging soldiers to sacrifice their lives was profoundly alien. I spent months trying to understand how an entire species could develop such an approach to military service, continued. I studied human history, their cultural evolution, their philosophical traditions. What I discovered changed my understanding of their nature permanently. The commander activated his recording device one final time. But instead of combat communications, the cantina was filled with what was clearly a human military graduation ceremony. Voices spoke in unison, reciting what was obviously an oath or pledge. I solemnly swear to support and defend the innocent against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I will bear true faith and allegiance to the cause of justice, and I will obey the orders of those appointed over me, according to the laws of war and my own conscience. I make this oath freely, without any mental reservation or purpose of evasion, and I will well and faithfully discharge the duties of the office upon which I am about to enter, so help me God. Deactivated the device, and the formal cadence of those human voices seemed to echo in the sudden silence. That oath is taken by every human who enters military service, but notice what it doesn't say. The young recruit looked confused. What do you mean? The commander's expression was grave. It doesn't mention victory, it doesn't mention survival, it doesn't even mention their own nation or species. The entire oath is about protecting others and following their conscience even unto death. The crowd murmured as the implications of that distinction became clear. Most military oaths focused on loyalty to state, species, or command structure. The human version elevated moral principles above institutional authority. This is why human military forces are so effective, continued. They're not fighting for territory or resources or political objectives. They're fighting for principles that they consider more important than their own lives. A veteran officer spoke up from the crowd. But surely such idealism creates tactical weaknesses. Enemies can exploit moral constraints. His mandibles clicked in disagreement. That's what every species assumes, and that's why human forces are so devastating in actual combat. Their moral constraints don't create weaknesses. They create predictable behaviors that appear to be weaknesses but are actually tactical advantages. The commander began packing again, his voice taking on the intensity of someone trying to convey a crucial insight. When the hegemony realized that humans would never abandon civilians, they assumed this could be exploited. Place civilians in strategic locations and human forces would be unable to attack effectively. He paused, letting the crowd think through the tactical implications. But that assumption was based on conventional military thinking. The hegemony failed to understand that humans don't see civilian protection as a constraint on their operations. They see it as their primary mission objective. The commander's expression grew distant as he recalled specific examples. During the liberation of Tau, hegemony forces surrounded themselves with civilian hostages, believing this would force human troops into a prolonged siege situation. Instead, human special operations teams infiltrated the compound and eliminated enemy forces using techniques so precise they didn't harm a single hostage. Several military officers in the crowd exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the difficulty of such operations. Close-quarters combat in hostile environments with civilian populations present required skills beyond normal military training. How is such precision possible in combat situations? Asked the intelligence officer. His voice carried a note of awe that was still evident years after witnessing these operations. Because they don't train for combat with civilian populations nearby. They train for combat where protecting civilians is the entire point of the operation. Every human soldier is taught to fight as if every civilian in the area is their own family member. The commander returned to his seat, finally sitting down for the first time since beginning his story. I watched human soldiers clear buildings room by room, eliminating enemy combatants with precision weapons while simultaneously providing medical aid to wounded civilians and protective cover for refugee evacuations. All simultaneously, all while under heavy fire. The young recruit looked incredulous. That's impossible. No one can manage that many variables in a combat environment. His compound eyes fixed on the young soldier with an expression that conveyed deep seriousness. That's what I thought too, until I realized that humans don't see those as separate variables. To them, eliminating enemies and protecting civilians are the same mission objective approached from different angles. The commander leaned forward, his voice dropping to ensure everyone had to listen carefully. This is the part that took me longest to understand, and it's the most important thing I can tell you about human military forces. They don't fight wars the way we do. They don't see conflict as something to be won or lost. They see it as something to be ended permanently. The implications of that statement created a stir among the crowd. Most galactic civilizations viewed warfare as a continuation of politics by other means, with victory conditions and acceptable outcomes that preserved future options for negotiation. Human military doctrine is built around a concept they call decisive action, continued. They don't seek to defeat enemies, they seek to make future conflict impossible. Every human military operation is planned with the assumption that it will be the final battle ever fought in that region. The commander stood and moved to the viewport once more, staring out at stars that had witnessed human military operations across the galaxy. This is why they accept casualties that other species would consider catastrophic. They're not trying to minimize losses in the current conflict. They're trying to prevent all future conflicts through the thoroughness of their current victory. A veteran called out from the crowd, but such thinking leads to strategic overextension. No military force can end all conflicts permanently. Turned back to face his audience, his expression conveying something between admiration and horror. You're applying conventional strategic thinking to a species that abandoned conventional strategy centuries ago. Humans don't plan individual operations, they plan generational outcomes. The commander's voice took on the weight of someone delivering profound truths. Every human military operation I witnessed was planned not just to achieve immediate tactical objectives, but to create conditions that would make similar operations unnecessary for the next century. They fight wars not to win battles, but to eliminate the need for future wars. The young recruit shifted uncomfortably. That sounds like an impossible standard. How can any military force plan for century-long outcomes? His mandibles clicked in a pattern that conveyed complex emotions. By accepting that current personnel are expendable in service of future peace, every human soldier understands that their death might prevent thousands of future deaths. They don't see sacrifice as tragic, they see it as strategic investment. The commander paused, organizing his thoughts before delivering what was clearly his most important observation. This is what makes human military forces so terrifying to fight against. They're not trying to survive the current war, they're trying to end warfare entirely in their area of operations. Every battle is approached as if it were the final battle that would determine the peace for generations. The cantina had grown completely silent, except for the soft hum of environmental systems. Beings from across the galaxy struggled to process the implications of military thinking so alien to their own cultural frameworks. After 3 years of combat operations alongside human forces, continued, I was rotated back to standard galactic command assignments. The transition was difficult. Working with conventional military units after experiencing human tactical doctrine felt like moving backward in evolutionary terms. The commander returned to his table one final time, his movements showing the weariness of someone who had carried heavy knowledge for too long. I requested reassignment to human theater operations 7 times. Each request was on the grounds that extended exposure to human military thinking was considered psychologically dangerous for non-human personnel. Several veterans in the crowd nodded grimly, clearly recognizing the institutional concern about psychological contamination from alien military doctrines. The final denial came with a mandatory psychological evaluation, continued. Command was concerned that I had developed what they called human tactical syndrome, a condition where non-human officers begin to prioritize mission objectives over personal survival to a degree considered unhealthy. The commander's voice carried a bitter note as he continued. They were right to be concerned. After serving alongside humans, conventional military operations felt inadequate, incomplete. Fighting wars designed to achieve limited political objectives while preserving options for future conflicts seemed like a waste of lives and resources. The young recruit leaned forward eagerly. So you requested transfer back to human units. His expression grew sad. I was informed that human military command had instituted their own restrictions on alien personnel in their operations. They had discovered that non-human soldiers serving alongside their forces were developing psychological conditions they called moral combat stress. The commander paused, clearly struggling with difficult memories. According to their medical officers, alien soldiers exposed to human military ethics were experiencing breakdowns when ordered to participate in conventional military operations afterward. The humans had decided that exposing us to their tactical doctrine was cruel. The implications of that revelation settled over the crowd. The idea that human military thinking was so alien that it could psychologically damage soldiers from other species was profoundly disturbing. So I was reassigned to training duties here on Station Omega-7, concluded. My official role is preparing joint operation commanders for potential cooperation with human military forces. Unofficially, I'm here to warn other species about what they're getting into when they request human military assistance. The commander looked around the crowded cantina, his compound eyes taking in faces from a dozen different species. That's why I finally agreed to tell this story publicly. Because too many beings in the galactic community see humans as valuable allies without understanding what that alliance really means. An officer near the bar spoke up. What should military commanders know before working with human forces? His expression became intensely serious. Understand that humans don't fight wars, they fight for principles that transcend warfare. If you call for human military assistance, be prepared for them to solve your conflict permanently, regardless of the cost. They will eliminate the source of the problem so thoroughly that similar conflicts become impossible. The commander's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. And understand that they will hold you to their standards while they're doing it. Human forces don't accept allies who are willing to compromise on civilian protection or who prioritize political objectives over moral imperatives. Serving alongside them will change you permanently. The young recruit looked both fascinated and troubled. Would you recommend against requesting human military aid? Considered the question for a long moment, his mandibles clicking softly as he thought. If you have a problem that needs to be solved permanently, if you're willing to accept that the solution might require sacrifices beyond anything you can imagine, and if you're prepared to hold yourself to moral standards that exceed tactical convenience, then yes, call for human assistance. The commander's voice dropped to barely audible levels. But understand that once you make that call, there's no going back. Humans don't do partial victories or negotiated settlements. They do complete solutions that eliminate future conflicts, regardless of the cost in lives or resources. He stood slowly, showing signs of the weariness that had accumulated over years of carrying difficult memories. The war ended 8 months after my reassignment. The hegemony surrendered unconditionally. Their leadership agreed to permanent oversight by galactic authorities, and their entire military structure was disbanded. Total victory achieved at a cost in human lives that other species would consider catastrophic. The commander moved toward the cantina exit, but paused to address the crowd one final time. The galaxy is at peace now because humans were willing to pay the price for permanent peace. They ended that war so completely that similar conflicts have become impossible. That's what human military forces do, and that's what makes them both the most valuable and most terrifying allies in the galaxy. As left the cantina, the crowd remained silent for several minutes, each being struggling to process what they had heard. The story of human military doctrine had revealed something about their species that was both inspiring and deeply alien to conventional galactic thinking. The young recruit remained at his table long after others had dispersed, staring at the bronze star had left behind. On its surface was engraved a simple message that somehow contained the entire philosophy of human military service, for those who cannot fight for themselves. Years later, when that young recruit had become a veteran officer himself, he would tell his own version of Commander's story. And like the commander before him, he would struggle to explain to younger soldiers what it meant to serve alongside a species that had turned warfare into an expression of moral principle, and death into a tool for creating peace.